Welcome back to the Personal Finance Project. Today, Scott and I are joined by Darrian Hornedo. She earned her BS at the University of Texas at Austin with a communications degree and a business foundations degree. She went on to Texas Tech University to earn her JD. She joined Baird in 2022 as an estate planner, and that puts her in part of the private wealth management part of Baird. She's a VP here at Baird, and she is currently pursuing her CFP. So, Darren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're really glad to have you too, Darian. To give our listeners just a little bit of context, what we've worked with Darian on in the past is Baird has a really nice function where we can really do a detailed estate planning review for a client. At that point, the client can kind of dig into what are some of the things out there that are really important. It might be a potential bogey or a roadblock in their own individual estate planning. So Darian has in the past helped us look at things like family limited partnerships, irrevocable life insurance trusts, and what we're going to be discussing today in a little bit more detail is the Spousal Lifetime Access Trust. And so, Darian, I'll let you kind of get the ball rolling. What is that structure of trust, and why has it been a little bit more popular in the news cycle lately?
Yeah. So a SLAT, also a spousal lifetime access trust, which is known as a SLAT, is basically an irrevocable trust that someone will create for the benefit of their spouse to get assets out of their taxable estate, but still maintain some benefit from those assets, right? And the reason that it's such a big deal right now is because the estate tax exemption is so high. Currently, the estate tax exemption is $13.9 million per spouse. And in 2026, the estate tax, if nothing happens, is set to sunset, which basically means that that amount will drop in half. Adjusted for inflation, we're thinking that's going to be around $7 million per spouse. So that's going to drop the estate tax, if it happens, significantly. Now, we don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know what it's going to drop to, but if it does, people are going to lose a large amount that they could be potentially getting out of their estate without having to pay estate taxes on. SLATs are a tool that we can use to get assets out of the taxable estate while still, like I said, maintaining some benefit from them. And so a lot of people are looking into SLATs with the anticipation that the estate tax exemption is going to drop at the end of next year.
So basically, Darren, a client, we would meet with them if they're in the position where they either have a taxable estate currently or they're worried that with sufficient growth on the underlying assets, they might find themselves at the end of their life with a taxable estate. The SLAT, you can essentially use your exemption amount at life. So you would use up that whole 13.9 million currently to fund the trust. So then your exemption would be dropped to zero. If your wife doesn't also fund one or your husband doesn't also fund one, they presumably still keep their exemption, and then the idea would be essentially to freeze the estate at the value that it was and then transfer all the growth out so that in the future, those assets are no longer part of the taxable estate. Am I understanding that right?
You're exactly right. The example I usually give to clients is, you have a married couple. The way that this would work, let's say you have an estate of 20 million. Now, what we're going to do is we want to use up at least, or we want to fund the flat with at least $7 million, right? The idea is if we're not going to fund it with what we expect the estate tax exemption to drop to, it doesn't really make sense, right? We're trying to take advantage of the fact that the estate tax exemption is so high. So we want to fund it with 7 million up to $13.9 million, whatever the client feels comfortable with. You're going to fund that SLAT for the benefit of your spouse. The idea is you get those assets out of your taxable estate, you count that towards your lifetime exemption, so you're not paying any gift tax or anything on that. And then your spouse during their lifetime gets to benefit from those assets. Now the idea is if your spouse is paying the mortgage, you get to live in the house with your spouse and indirectly benefit from that. If your spouse takes a trip, I would assume that your spouse is probably going to take you on that trip with them. So you're indirectly benefiting from the assets in the SLAT, but they are outside of your taxable estate. And so, like you just said, we want to put assets that are going to appreciate in that SLAT because the idea is as they grow, spouse and you indirectly have more access to the assets, but they're not going to inflate your taxable estate, which is a really good tool in estate planning.
And so in that situation, you mentioned something about, the assumption is that you would benefit from the things that your spouse is doing and get invited on the trip to, the Caribbean or wherever it might be. Are there any potential legal hiccups that you could run into in terms of, things that would not be legitimate for accessing that side of the estate, or is it pretty open?
That's a great question. So it really depends on who the trustee of the trust is. And so the beneficiary, which would be the spouse, could be the trustee of that trust. But if the spouse is the trustee of the SLAT, so they're the trustee and the beneficiary, income and principal is going to be limited to health, education, maintenance, and support. It's still a very broad term and it can be used for a lot. But when the trustee is also the beneficiary, it gets a little gray in terms of what they're using the assets for. So it can get a little sticky. I always recommend having a third party trustee. And the reason for that is because then you have a lot more access to those funds. And if a third party is the one making the distributions, Scott, you can really use those assets for anything. And it's not going to re-include that in your taxable estate. There are reasons that it could be included back into your taxable estate, and those are things we'll talk about, like the reciprocal trust doctrine.
Right.
And then also, if you end up getting a divorce or the spouse predeceases the creating spouse, then some issues may arise in that instance. But when using the assets, as long as you have a third party trustee, you can really use them for anything that you would like to.
And then Darren, if this exceeds the work that you've done, obviously just let us know. I don't think that it will, but Scott and I are Texas based, and that's a community property state. And so most of the clients that we would be working with who fear that they might have a taxable estate, virtually all of their assets are held as community property. It's very rare that we see people who hold their assets as separate property in a community property state. And so you helped us with a case that was exactly like this, where it sounded like there were some more complicating factors if 100% of the assets currently residing in the estate were jointly owned in a community property setting. So my understanding was you had to partition the estate first, and then you could go about the business of funding a SLAT or funding two SLATs. How complicating a factor is that for community property listeners?
It's not that complicated. You're exactly right. We would have to partition the assets. So if we are going to fund reciprocal SLATs, we would want to just partition them in half. We'd put half of the assets in spouse one's name and half of the other half in spouse two's name. It's not very difficult. It just takes time. The real issue comes with, is the client willing to give up control of those assets? And I think that's the first question you need to ask before you even go into, are we going to partition these assets? Because the SLAT sounds like an amazing option until you tell the client you are giving up control of $15 million. And then, you have a $20 million estate, they take a step back, right? And they're like, well, I don't know if I'm willing to do that. The partitioning part, not that difficult. You have to get an attorney. I mean, is it a walk in the park? No. We're still going to have to figure out what all the assets are, divide them in half. Are they willing to do that? Are there assets that can be divided, depending on what the assets are, and kind of going through that route? But it's something with an attorney that can be done pretty quickly. I think the harder part is wrapping the client's mind around the loss of control of those assets.
Yeah, Darian, I think that's a great point because especially with the clients that I work with who are, say, right around a current taxable estate, from the outside, it's a phenomenal amount of money. But when you kind of really talk about the percentage of that you're giving away control on, say you do 7 million and you're around 20 million, which is, I'm not saying that's not a lot of money, the loss of control on that, say 35% of your net worth at a minimum, that is a lot of times a hurdle that just makes it, you can't overcome that in the planning process.
Exactly. And that's one of the biggest disadvantages that I see. I mean, these trusts are irrevocable. So once the idea is that we're getting it out of your taxable estate, you're losing control and direct access, right? You're going to maintain a little bit of indirect access, but that is one of the disadvantages of these trusts. And really, I think it's a mental hurdle more than it is anything else for these clients. And you really kind of have to ask them to weigh the pros and the cons between, do they want the control or do they want the estate protection, and really kind of
And
seeing what's more important to them.
And Darren, we have a client base, probably not unique to us, but maybe so. They tend to be worst case scenario type thinkers, you know? And I think in this case, you fund the SLAT and then you have an untimely death or divorce. Can you walk us through how, are there any protections you can build into a SLAT that can sort of claw back some of that, even though it is an irrevocable trust? Or what would happen if, say, because gray divorce is a real problem. I mean, it happens to a lot of people. And I think this would be a major consideration for some clients who are wondering, okay, what's the maximum downside here? Where would I really get harmed by having done this SLAT idea?
Absolutely. So I will kind of give two different scenarios. The first one being death. So obviously the untimely death of the beneficiary is probably more common. And what I see often happen is spouse one, husband will create SLAT first, the benefit of the wife, and then wife either has an untimely death 5 years later, right? The whole idea is that the spouse that created the trust is going to indirectly benefit through the wife while wife died. It doesn't automatically go back to husband because it's outside of his taxable estate. It's going to go to his children or whoever he decides the remaining beneficiary should be. Now, I see this often where kids will then inherit whatever assets were inside of this SLAT, and mom or dad or whoever was the creator they don't want to ask kids for money. That's
Right.
common. They don't want to ask their kids for money. They don't want to have to go back and forth. And then if kids end up giving money back to dad, we're in the same position we were before. We're actually creating more complexity because then the kids are gifting to dad and they may have some estate tax issues too. So that's kind of the first issue, right? At death, you lose control. You don't get these assets back. Now, the second scenario would be divorce. Ideally, these trusts are going to be drafted in a way that at divorce, you don't get these assets back, right? Because the whole idea is we're getting them out of your estate. They're irrevocable. You do not have control of these assets. Now, they can be drafted in a way where divorce would basically terminate the SLAT. The problem with that is that you already gifted to this SLAT. Let's say you gifted 13.9 million. You've used up your estate tax exemption. You don't get the gift back. That's already been gifted.
Oh, okay.
And then those assets are back in your taxable estate. So you're right where you started with zero estate tax gifting, right? So you can't continue to gift. I mean, you could, but you would have to pay gift taxes on them. And we kind of lose the opportunity to freeze your estate. So
Okay.
you really want to talk to your spouse. I always tell people, you really want to trust your spouse on this. You want to have a good relationship with whoever you create this with, because divorce will really, for lack of a better word, screw up the entire process if we end up creating this and then get divorced. Because yes, you can get those assets back, but for estate tax purposes, it's not gonna be helpful.
Yeah. I was wondering if they could allow for that, but I imagine now they're saying it is a completed gift. So you are using up your exemption, even if you've written a clause into the trust that allows for the dissolution of the SLAT at divorce. You don't get the exemption back. Like it's gone forever. So I suppose it's a completed gift in one sense, even if there's this kind of trap door you can go through in the event of emergency. But what you get back is going to be a very big tax bill, is what it sounds like.
Exactly. And I'm assuming most of the time these assets grow. You're gonna be in
Oh,
an even worse position than you were when you started.
Is it possible that that money coming back to you could be taxable, like as a gift if it grew enough?
No, you might have to pay capital gains tax on it.
Okay.
But if it's going back to you, it would probably be written into the SLAT in such a way. Usually, what happens is they define spouse. So once you get divorced, that is no longer defined, and so the SLAT would be null and void. That would definitely be something we would have to talk to the client's CPA about in the event that it happened, but definitely going to cause some tax issues.
but that was a good point, Scott, because this is another oversight that clients will occasionally make is they want to fund the SLATs with the ultimate beneficiary not necessarily being whom the trust was created to benefit, because we kind of know there's an indirect benefit flowing back to the creator of the trust, but their children. So the children are the ultimate beneficiary of the asset. And you touched on this just a second ago when you said there's a lack of a step up in basis. with these assets at the death of the trust owners or the beneficiaries of the trust, the first beneficiaries of the trust. Kind of difficult to get through all the various beneficiaries of these trusts. But when the kids inherit these assets, there is going to be an embedded tax liability, because if these were just jointly held rather than having been removed from the taxable estate of the parents, all of the appreciation they're going to get in those trusts, that is going to just flow straight down to the next generation. And if they want to take some money out of that, and I assume they probably will, they will have a tax bill. And I would imagine with you counseling clients, Darrian, if they've got really high octane growth assets, those are the ones they want in the SLAT to begin with. Because that's growing outside the estate. So it's kind of like, yeah, you get one benefit on the estate tax code, and that's the estate tax is way more onerous than capital gains tax, but that big step up in basis is also going to be foregone.
Yeah, you really have to ask yourself. It's one of those situations where you can't have your cake and eat it too. What's more important? Not having to pay estate taxes at your death, or your kids not having to pay the basis adjustment when they inherit those assets? And it's really looking at what kind of assets you have, looking at the net worth and the growth, right, of what your estate is going to grow to, how much you're using during your lifetime, how much you're gifting, and then really asking yourself what's more important. Some people say, I don't really care about my kids having to pay capital gains tax. They're going to come into XYZ, they can pay it. And not paying estate taxes is way more important to me. Then, we fund that SLAT. Whereas some people say, I have really appreciated stock that I want my kids to get access to or want that basis adjustment for. And so we would want to keep those assets inside their taxable estate to receive that basis adjustment at death. It's kind of like the control thing. They just have to figure out what's more important to them.
So Darrian, the way I'm kind of hearing you say this, it sounds like you feel like if you're kind of like on the threshold of a taxable estate, or if you're concerned it could drop and then you're going to have one, that's probably not the ideal candidate for this particular vehicle. Like this is probably somebody who's solidly into estate tax territory today, right?
So that's a hard thing. Who would benefit from this is a hard question to answer, because I feel that anybody who has at least $13.9 million can benefit from this in the sense that we want to take advantage of what the exemption is. And we also want to plan. So you're right. We want people who have $50-60 million should be doing SLATs, right? We should be taking advantage of the estate tax exemption. The problem is they're going to have an estate tax. They're already so far over the estate tax exemption that we can only focus on freezing their estates. Now, the people with $20, $24, $25 million, they're in a position where we could potentially eliminate all estate tax, but they're in a weird spot where are we willing to give up that much control of our network, right? And so I think it depends more. Anyone can really benefit from it. It's really just how much is the client willing to benefit from it, right? How much control are they willing to lose? I think that it's easier to get clients who are over the estate tax exemption to kind of wrap their head around SLATs, where it's a little bit harder to get clients that are in that $15 to $25 million rate to get comfortable with losing control of that. But really, I think anybody that is concerned about the estate tax dropping and would have a taxable estate at that point should consider a SLAT.
And Darrian, you touched on this earlier. You actually said the line that I was going to say, having your cake and eating it too. And I think this really becomes a central issue with the reciprocal SLATs or the mirror SLATs, or I fund one trust, you fund another, and then we scratch each other's backs and we go have a great time down in the Caribbean. Like that all sounds really great, but anytime Scott or I hear something like that, we're waiting for the IRS audit to come in through your front door and make your life very unpleasant. So my review of these things is very perfunctory. I've just noticed there's some red flags, it seems, where if the trusts are funded conspicuously at the same time, probably not the best look. And this is going to be more of a difficulty for some of our clients, because I could appreciate if you have very disparate assets. So you maybe have like a closely held business or some real estate, some stocks and bonds, what have you. You could make the trusts pretty different with the nature or the composition of the assets. But if you just have, say, mutual funds, bond funds, and equity funds, and that pretty much is your whole taxable estate, how can you make these substantially different enough to have them not violate that reciprocal trust doctrine or the mirror trust doctrine? Or how do you guys kind of plan around that?
Ultimately, you always want to consult your attorney for your specific state that you live in when you're looking at the reciprocal trust doctrine. Ultimately, what that is for anyone listening to this that doesn't know is if the SLATs are very similar or created around the same time, the IRS will basically say, these are not SLATs. We see what you're doing here. And for federal estate tax purposes, these are considered part of your taxable estate, right? So defeats the entire purpose. Now, what you said was completely right. Creating SLATs at different times, making sure they have different beneficiaries, making sure that they have different distribution terms. So if one spouse can access income and principal for health, education, maintenance, and support, we maybe want to change that for the other spouse. Sometimes I hear clients say, well, I'm just going to create this trust and then I'll wait a couple weeks and create the next trust. Well, it doesn't really work like that. You really need time to comprehend, what you're doing and think about, do you want to create this next trust? The IRS is just trying to make sure that you didn't create at the creation of the first document, you weren't already planning to create the second one, right? And so
Right.
there's different ways around that. And sometimes, SLATs can be on the surface pretty different, and in the IRS's eyes, that's going to violate the reciprocal trust doctrine. So ultimately, we want to talk to our attorney. We want to look at that when we are thinking about SLATs. I think the best way to start is let's start with one spouse. Usually consider the spouse that we anticipate is going to live longer to create. We want them to be the beneficiary of the trust.
Okay.
Analyze our estate, see what's going on, and then maybe later we can go ahead and say, you know what, I think it would be beneficial to take advantage of a second SLAT for the remaining spouse. But ultimately, the easiest ways to violate the doctrine are creating the document at the same time, having the same distribution rules and or the same beneficiaries, and then obviously having the same terms, right? The same terms as what's going to happen to the SLAT. Also, we don't want both SLATs to have that divorce. We were talking
Right.
about the divorce clause. We don't want both SLATs to have that either. So it's little things, and we definitely want to talk to our attorneys to ensure that they're not violating that doctrine.
Okay. Yeah, because I think one of the things Scott and I wanted to pour a little cold water on was this notion that it's as easy as divide the estate perfectly in half, fund both slats, and then boom, spend the income coming off of the trust together. And it seems like that would be a real red flag to the IRS saying no. Because I imagine they examine not just the composition of the trust, but also how it's being used. And I can imagine you could violate the reciprocal trust doctrine on both of those fronts, where it's like, yeah, you put a bunch of stock in one and a bunch of bonds in the other, but you're using them exactly the same way. That's not different enough. And then the other issue we thought of was big purchases down the line. So if they wanted to buy property or something like that, how would that be owned? Would they own that in the trust, outside of the trust? Have you had any experience with clients suddenly getting a wild hair and saying, actually, we want to buy a boat or a vacation home, but all of our money is tied up in this SLAT? How do we now own an asset with all of our money in there? I'm venturing people have had this problem.
Yeah, so usually what will happen, and I see this more in situations where there's one SLAT, but the SLAT will own it, and then at death it passes to the children. So we run into that same issue where, spouse potentially loses control of that asset or indirect access to that asset. So what you can do is depreciating assets, so things like cars, boats, we don't necessarily want to buy inside of a SLAT. We're not necessarily wanting to put businesses inside of SLATs. These are going to be more assets that we know we're going to appreciate, are going to stay in the trust, and are going to be easier to bifurcate at the first spouse's death, right? Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when you have reciprocal SLATs and all of our assets are tied up in this. We really just run into the issue of whose SLAT are we going to put it in, and you usually want to put it in the SLAT of the spouse. We think it's going to, unfortunately, we never know, right, who's going to pass away first.
Right.
But you're going to want to put it in the spouse's SLAT that we anticipate is going to live longer, right?
Okay.
So they maintain access to those.
One thing that just popped into my mind a second ago was, yes, we don't know who's going to pass away first. How about a situation where we are pretty darn sure, like somebody's very ill, as an example, is there a time requirement that has to be in place before this is a legitimate irrevocable gift?
There's not. So basically,
Okay.
you would just want to create that trust. So basically, the person with the terminal illness or that we know is going to pass away first is going to be the one that creates the SLAT for the benefit of their spouse. And then, unfortunately, when they pass away, surviving spouse will still have access to that. The problem really arises when it happens opposite, when the beneficiary dies first. But yeah, Scott, there's no timeline that you have to
So
follow. You just have to make sure that it's executed before the death.
okay, so there's not like a 3 or 5 year look back on any of that.
No, no, it's not. It's not going to be like any of those Medicaid or Medicare protection trusts.
Okay.
Interesting. And then, so just as kind of a final thought and how this ties in, do you see a lot of usage of the SLATs along with something like irrevocable life insurance trusts or family limited partnerships, or is this typically like this is the route we're going to go? We're not going to try to go a couple different directions with the
That's a
advanced
great
estate
question,
planning
and I
idea?
think it depends on the net worth of the client. I think it depends on where they're at and what they're looking for. I think clients that aren't necessarily have a 50, $60 million taxable estate, we're good with SLATs and we don't have to worry about if we're worried about paying some type of estate tax. So if we're over that exemption already, we may consider an ILIT to help us, cover that estate tax fee when we pass away.
Right.
But most of the time, it's just going to depend on the client and where they're at financially. But I see all the time people incorporating ILITs, SLATs, family limited partnerships, all of them together. But it's really going to depend on the goals of the client and the complexity of the estate.
And then Darren, I suppose one last question for you. In the lead up to this sunset, how much do you worry about over planning in an estate or over complicating things when it seems like you could probably get by with a far more, simple solution?
Yeah. So this is really hard for those clients that are in between that like
Yeah.
15 to $28 million, right? Because they're at a point where they're worried about giving up control. They may not have to if the estate tax doesn't change. And so my recommendation is if you like the idea of a SLAT, let's get one drafted. And you don't have to fund it. You can draft it. You can meet with the attorney because that's the hard part right now. Is everybody's trying to plan for this sunset. So attorneys are backed up. It's already almost May, right, of 2025. And so we want to have this funded. We want to have this, I'm sorry, drafted by the end of 2025. So if it's starting to get towards the end and we think that this exemption is going to drop in half, it's a quick phone call to fund these SLATs. The drafting of it is what takes a long time. And so if
Okay.
it's something that you're considering, I would reach out to your estate planning attorney, get something drafted, have it there, right, as a backup. And then if the estate tax exemption stays what it is or gets higher, awesome. You don't have to do anything. But if for some reason it drops, then we can take advantage of that and fund it at the end of this year. So it's kind of giving you, a little bit of protection, right? Is to do the planning, but not fund it.
Yeah, I like that flexibility. It's to use an expression that we use sometimes. It's heads I win, tails you lose. So if the estate exemption stays high, we're just going to keep rolling. If it's going to go down, then we make that phone call, initiate the SLAT.
Exactly.
Well, Darian, I think those were most of the things that we wanted to cover on today's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. Any final or parting thoughts on the subject?
No, I think ultimately when you're considering SLATs, just remember that these are irrevocable trusts. So you are giving up access to any of the assets that you're putting into this trust. You want to think about your relationship. You want to think about if you're ever, the younger you are, you can get divorced at any point. So think about that. And then just remember it's a really good tool, but there are always pros and cons, and you want to speak to your attorney and your financial advisors to make sure that it's a good plan for you.
Well, great. Really appreciate you joining us
Excellent.
today. Great summary. And we will hopefully chat with you again.
Of course, you all have a great day. It was great talking to you.
Great talking to you, Darren.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. Investors should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses of a fund carefully before investing. This and other information is found in the prospectus and summary prospectus. For a prospectus, please contact your financial professional and read it carefully before investing. Annuities carry unique risks, including market risk, investment risk, and claims paying abilities of the insurer. There may also be instances where a contract will pay out less than the premiums paid or expire within the lifetime of the insured. There may be penalties for early withdrawal, and they are not insured by the FDIC because they are insurance, not an investment. Investors should consider carefully information contained in the prospectus or, if available, the summary prospectus, including investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. You can request a prospectus by reaching out to your financial advisor. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Investment returns will fluctuate and are subject to market volatility, so that an investor's shares, when redeemed or sold, may be worth more or less than their original cost. Unlike mutual funds, shares of ETFs are not individually redeemable directly with the ETF. Shares of ETFs are bought and sold at market price, which may be higher or lower than the net asset value. This broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated.